You've got shit. I've got shit. We've all got shit. So let's therapize that shit with your host, me, Joy Gerhard. Please note, I am not a therapist. I cannot and do not diagnose anyone or prescribe anything. This is just me, someone who struggles with mental illness, emotions, and intrusive thoughts, sharing what skills I've used and how I've used them. Also, trigger warning, in this podcast, I talk about sensitive topics including mental illness, suicidal ideation, self-harm, rape, childhood sexual assault, trauma, and more. I also swear here and there, so listener discretion is advised. If you're new to the podcast, some context for you. I've gotten a ton of value out of doing group therapy and watching others process their shit. In group, I can see other people's patterns and behaviors much more clearly because they aren't my patterns and behaviors, but rather they're adjacent to mine. It's such a relief. I want to share this relief with you via this podcast, wherein I practice skills while actually in the thick of shit. Each episode, I typically do an introduction and provide some context. Then I play a recording of me actively dealing with shit. This isn't me talking about psychology or theories. I'm actually in distress, having strong emotions and strong urges. You're going to hear me crying, angry, numb. But my intention is always to move through an emotion, never to stay there. So stick with me, and we'll actually come out on the other side by the end of the episode. Alrighty, let's hop to it. Welcome. This is going to be a different kind of episode. Yes, I say this every time, but every time is a little bit different, so it stays accurate. Typically, I listen to the recording that I, recorded 7 months ago or whatever, and then write down notes of things I want to include in my intro and my outro. This time I'm not doing that. This time I'm just going to talk without any notes whatsoever. And the reason for that is I was listening back. Pause. Let me start at the beginning. The main recording for this episode was recorded on May 1st, 2022. It is December 2nd. So what is that? 7 months later. And I spent yesterday and today listening back to it, and I'm like, fuck. This is all good stuff, and it is not me demonstrating a skill. And that is one of the key features of why this podcast exists. It is not an echo chamber for my own voice. It's there as an accountability thing so that I have a thing that keeps me practicing skills. And it's also a way to not have to repeat myself so much because I hate repeating myself. But this one, I'm not using a skill. So I'm listening to it and going, well, what the fuck am I going to do? Because I think it's useful information to have out there in the world. And it does not fit the criteria for what I created this podcast for. And then I had a thought that makes me feel like the ground is dropped out from underneath me. On episode 4, way back in the day, I went for an angry walk and recorded myself on this angry walk. And then I did commentary afterwards and kind of spliced in the commentary into the original recording. And I thought I would do that here. But instead of making observations about what skills I'm using, I thought I would validate myself. And that is why I feel like the earth has fallen out from underneath me. I really, really, really don't like self-validation. I don't like practicing it. I don't like even thinking about practicing it. It feels very, very dangerous to me. And it brings up a lot of oh shit. So before we get into the bulk of the episode, the recording that I'm going to play for you, and then, of course, the spliced-in commentary wherein I validate myself, we're going to do a bit of observe and describe about this oh shit feeling that I have, because I don't know what that is. I don't need to know what it is, and I would like to identify what machinery is running in the background, what thoughts I'm having. So initially, and I've joked about this before, that self-validation kind of feels like the off-brand version, like Safeway Select. I've said Kirkland brand before, but as has been pointed out to me by multiple people, Kirkland is actually a really good brand. And so that's not an effective analogy. The more effective analogy would be Safeway Select. So self-validation feels a lot like Safeway Select brand. And it makes sense that it would, because I'm not all that skilled at self-validation. So when I do it, it's just super janky. It's a bit of a shit show. And it doesn't feel nearly as good as when somebody else does it. And part of the reason why somebody else doing it feels so good is because it's like deprivation, 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 and then all of a sudden oasis in the desert. And wow, here's this validation coming from an external source. And it tastes so much better because of all the deprivation. And because when I self-validate, it doesn't feel great, I don't want to practice it, because why would I want to practice doing something that doesn't feel great, which is an absurd premise, because it's like saying, why would I want to practice something that I'm bad at? So that you can become better at it, Joy. That's the answer to that question. But there's another thing that I'm realizing beyond that has me go, oh shit. I'm going to use an analogy because it's all I have access to right now. So I was watching a movie earlier today. It features a pilot that has an oh shit moment of, we are out of missiles, we are out of bullets, we are out of gas, we are out of everything, and have no way to call for help. And that feeling to me kind of feels like the top of a parabola where you're just kind of hanging there. Like we have used up our own propulsive power, which would be the going up the parabola. And we have yet to be driven by gravity's like accelerative force. Like, so the ballistic situation of an aircraft. Doing self-validation feels like an acknowledgement of there is no help coming. I have used up all of my external resources, and now it rests completely on my own, whatever I carry with me. There's no refueling plane coming. There's no Navy SEALs that are gonna like parachute in. I have exactly me and my own resources, and that is it. I am fucking nervous about going through this recording and validating myself. Like really fucking nervous. It feels very, very dangerous to me. In my body, it feels dangerous. Like this is a bad thing. Okay, hang on, I'm sitting with it. Okay, here's the thing that just came up. I'm leaving all the pauses in because I'm just sitting here and looking. Why does this feel bad, Joy? What about this feels bad, Joy? It feels incredibly vulnerable in the following way. If you've ever made anything as an adult, I think very small kids, it doesn't occur to them to be self-conscious. It doesn't occur to them that somebody's going to tell them what they made sucked. So very small children will show you a scribble on a piece of paper and go, look at what I made. But there is a vulnerability that comes once we realize that, oh, it matters to me what other people think about me. It matters to me that they think I'm worthy. So there's that very severe, and it gets worse as we get older, right? Or at least it did for me. I know that there are confident people out there. I've heard tale of them. I know that they exist somewhere. But for me, the older I get, the more uncomfortable I am sharing what I've made with other people. Because the more I think I'm aware that they could just not fucking care. And it's a specific type of sharing. It's why I downplay every fucking thing. It's not like, look at this amazing thing I did. It's, look at this thing I half-assed. Because the worst case scenario here is that if I say it's amazing and they're like, oh God, this is you trying your hardest? Oh dear. Oh dear. And I think that's what I'm concerned about in validating myself and fucking recording myself, validating myself. Because what I'm doing in doing that is saying, I'm going to point out all the ways in which the recording I'm about to play for you makes sense. And I'm like gonna plant my flag in that. That's a very imperialistic analogy. I can't think of another phrase, so I'm just going to go with I'm planting my flag there. And that's different than if I just play the recording and if somebody says, oh God, Joy, I listened to the recording and none of what you were saying made sense. I have plausible deniability. I could go, I know, right? Like, that was Joy from 7 months ago, and she was clearly in distress, and God. But I'm about to come right out and say that everything I said in the recording makes sense and comes from somewhere and is caused. And I'm about to point out all of the ways I think it makes sense and comes from somewhere and is caused. And, oh, fuck. So I have pretty significant depersonalization, derealization. I doubt my own memory a lot. I doubt my own existence. I can see something, like experience it, touch it, and then turn around and doubt that I saw it, touched it, anything. I doubt my own experience kind of most of the time, to the point where I am very, very uncomfortable making any sort of declarative statement about my experience because I expect to be told that it's wrong. And the thing about that is it's actually more dangerous to my brain, to my sense of reality, to be told that my experience is wrong than it is to just not share my experience. If I never share my experience, it's like Schrodinger's experience. If I never share it, I can never get invalidated for it. But there's this specific, and it's that fucking top of the parabola, that fucking vomit comet feeling of there's a moment when I share a thing with someone and I don't yet know if they're going to validate it or not. If they're going to tell me that it didn't happen that way, that I'm remembering it wrong, that I'm making it up, that Satan has twisted their words, that I'm choosing to focus on the negative and not acknowledging the whole truth, like all of this shit. I don't know if that's about to happen or if they'll say, oh yeah, that makes total sense. So it's very, very, very scary. And the floor feels like it falls out from underneath me. So the idea of recording myself, validating myself, feels like that child going up to an adult and saying, hey, look at this picture I drew. It's the best picture I've ever drawn. And the adult going, really? That's your best? Okay. I'll pat you on the head and send you on your way. So I feel very anxious and uncomfortable about this. I'm doing some willing hands here. I'm going to do some box breathing for a second. I am safe right now. 5 things I see. My t-shirt hanging up on my door. My nautical map. My lamp. My Nalgene bottle. My trash can. 5 things I feel. I feel my bedspread on my hand. I feel the back of my thigh touching my foot. I feel my hair on my shoulders. I feel my earbuds in my ears. I feel the back of my teeth with my tongue. Five things I hear. I hear my own voice. I hear the sound of my earbuds cord rustling. I hear the whir of my laptop motor. I hear my breath. I hear my hand rubbing against my comforter. Another deep breath, Joy. Okay. So before we get into the recording, now that I'm feeling calmer, I wanted to do a brief orientation of what DBT is, my standard song and dance. Most of the skills that I reference are from the DBT manual by Marsha Linehan. DBT stands for Dialectic Behavioral Therapy, and it is my therapy modality, my therapy type of choice. The DBT manual is linked in the description, both where you can find a PDF of it online and also where you can buy a hard copy. Whenever I am quoting the DBT manual, or really any work other than my own, I turn on some reverb so that I sound like I'm in a gas station, or more accurately, a gas station bathroom. I will be referencing handouts from several of the DBT modules in this episode, of which there are 4. Mindfulness, interpersonal effectiveness, emotion regulation, and distress tolerance. So when I mention a handout that I'm reading from, I'll say something like, this is from Interpersonal Effectiveness Handout 5, or whatever, so that you can follow along if you're so inclined. And it also allows you to search on the website for this podcast. If you hear me mention a skill and you want to hear other episodes that talk about it, if you search what that skill is on my website, you'll be able to find other episodes that talk about it. And speaking of DBT skills, you just heard me use 3 of them to help calm myself down before launching into my little DBT spiel. I was using 3 different distress tolerance skills to help address my anxiety. I mentioned using willing hands, box breathing, and also 5 things I see, hear, and feel. So let's go through those real quick, one by one. Willing hands is from Distress Tolerance Handout 14, titled Half Smiling in Willing Hands. It's for accepting reality with your body. And I was doing willing hands sitting. The instructions for that are: place your hands on your lap or your thighs with hands unclenched. Turn your hands outward with palms up and fingers relaxed. So typically how I look when I do that, I'm not actually resting my hands on my thighs. I'm resting them on my bedspread on either side of my thighs. I kind of look like I'm carrying 2 plates of food, trying to squeeze through a very narrow opening sideways. And the reason that this works is your hands communicate to your brain, your body connects to your mind. I end up clenching my hands and doing nervous things with my hands that communicate to my brain that, hey, we're super, super anxious. So if I can get my hands to relax, I can oftentimes get the rest of me to relax too. The other thing I mentioned using just now was box breathing, which is a form of paced breathing. Pace breathing is part of the TIP skills. That's Distress Tolerance Handout 6, entitled TIP Skills Changing Your Body Chemistry, which is to reduce extreme emotion mind fast. TIP is an acronym that stands for temperature, intense exercise, and the P stands for both paced breathing and paired muscle relaxation. Paced breathing is when you pace your breathing by slowing it down. The way it's described on the handout is breathe deeply into your belly, slow your pace of inhaling and exhaling way down, on average 5 to 6 breaths per minute. Breathe out more slowly than you breathe in. For example, 5 seconds in and 7 seconds out. So just breathing in and out super slowly to me feels like hyperventilation, like in my body, that's how it feels. So I like box breathing, which includes adding a hold at the top of an inhale and at the bottom of an exhale. So what I was doing was in for 6, hold for 6, out for 10, because it's important to have the exhales longer. I haven't done that in the past, but I was just reminded of this by my therapist. So in for 6, hold for 6, out for 10, hold for 6. So it's less of a box and more of a trapezoid. All sides are 6 except for the exhale, which is longer for me, 10 seconds. And everybody's preference is different in terms of how long each of those sides are. I also did a self-soothing skill. Examples of those are included on Distress Tolerance Handout 8, entitled Self-Soothing, which uses the 5 senses to calm. I was identifying 5 things I see, 5 things I feel, and 5 things I hear. When I'm in major distress, I will do 5 each of things that I see, feel, and hear, and then do 4 each of the things I see, feel, and hear, and then 3 each, and then 2 each, and then 1 each, and then go back up to 2, 3, 4, 5, and then back down again, and just keep going until I get calm. The whole point of it is to force my body to pay attention to exclusively now, this moment right here, because the only things I can sense with my eyes are things in the present moment, and the only things I can feel with my skin are things in the present moment, and the only things I can hear with my ears are things in the present moment. So it forces me out of strong emotion mind, which is usually based off of past memories or future anxieties. Yeah. And now, before I forget, a huge, massive thank you to my Patreon supporters. Sunny and Juicy are our newest supporters, followed by Andrew, who has been supporting me for about a month now. Thank you so much to you guys. You're incredible and delightful and amazing. And I also, of course, want to give huge props to the original supporters, Anne and Ruth, who have been with me since this podcast's genesis. You all are, what are you? Rocket scientists? Bioluminescent jellyfish? Something cool? And are 96.7% of the reason that this podcast exists for public consumption. That's a highly technical and very specific number. So thank you so much. And if you, dear listener, would like to support this podcast, the link to my Patreon is in the description. So we're going to dive in now to the recording that I mentioned earlier, which was recorded again on May 1st. This is being recorded on December 2nd. And we're going to do some self-validation now. And I know I said we were just about to pop into the recording. Before we do that, let's define what validation is for a second, shall we? So if you are in any sort of data anything, you may be familiar with what validation is in a data context. Per Merriam-Webster, validation is the act, process, or instance of validating. How about that? Let's look up validating then. To make legally valid, to confirm the validity of. Let's look up what valid is. Here we go. Well-grounded or justifiable, being at once relevant and meaningful, logically correct, appropriate to the end in view, having legal efficacy or force. Okay, so that's like data/law, whatever. We're going to talk about validation from the perspective of interpersonal and self-communication. So it's weird to me that validation is in the interpersonal effectiveness module of DBT. To me, it seems more like a mindfulness skill. Maybe check the facts, actually, which is an emotion regulation skill. But for whatever reason, good old Marcia has deemed it appropriate, has deemed it valid to put validation under interpersonal effectiveness because, and here's probably why she did that. One of the skills in interpersonal effectiveness is called the give skill, GIVE. It's from Interpersonal Effectiveness Handout 6, Guidelines for Relationship Effectiveness, Keeping the Relationship, in parentheses, give. And of course, the V in it is validate. And it's skills that one can use when making a request or declining something that fosters the relationship. So validation is important there. So what is validation? We're going to jump ahead to Interpersonal Effectiveness Handout 17, very cleverly titled Validation. Validation means finding the kernel of truth in another person's perspective or situation. It also means verifying the facts of a situation. Validation means acknowledging that a person's emotions, thoughts, and behaviors have causes and are therefore understandable. Validation is not necessarily agreeing with the other person. Validation is not validating what is actually invalid. Why validate? It improves our relationships by showing we are listening and understand. And talking about myself here, self-validate, it improves my relationship to myself by showing myself that I'm actually listening to myself and understanding myself. Another reason we validate, it improves interpersonal effectiveness by reducing pressure to prove who's right, negative reactivity, and anger. It makes problem solving, closeness, and support possible. And finally, why validate? Invalidation hurts. It's true. It does. I've done the experiments myself. Important things to validate. The valid and only the valid. The facts of a situation. A person's experiences, feelings, emotions, beliefs, opinions, or thoughts about something. Which, for me, it's important to validate my experiences, feelings, emotions, beliefs, opinions, and thoughts about something. And it's also important to validate suffering and difficulties. Remember, every invalid response makes sense in some way. Validation is not necessarily agreeing. Validation doesn't mean you like it. And finally, only validate the valid. So that's what validation is. And this sheet mentions a couple times that we're not supposed to validate the invalid. So what's an example of that? And I'm going to use my same old stupid example, which is a judgment. You wake up on the morning of your wedding, which is supposed to be an outdoor wedding, and it's raining. Type of rain where it's not going to stop all day. And you have the thought, my wedding's ruined. So we're not going to validate that your wedding is ruined. We can validate that you had the thought. Of course you're going to have that thought. It makes sense that you would have that thought. It makes sense that you feel upset, sad, discouraged, frustrated. It makes sense that you're having your thoughts. It makes sense that you're having your feelings. And we're not going to validate the fact that your wedding is ruined. Because your wedding is ruined isn't what happened. Now, what happened may be my wedding is not going to go the way I thought it was going to go. Or my wedding is not going to go the way I wish it was going to go. Totally. Yep, those are the facts. If you thought your wedding was going to be outside on a dry day. But yeah. So that's kind of the distinction between validating what is valid and not validating what is invalid. Which brings us, of course, now to the steps of validation. And very generously, Marsha Linehan has included in her dbt manual a how-to guide to validation. It is on Interpersonal Effectiveness Handout 18, and it is titled, are you ready for this? You're not ready for this. It's going to blow your mind. The creativity. It's so incredible. It is entitled, A How-To Guide to Validation. Pause for you to reassemble your mind now that it's been blown. Are we good? Okay. So, high level, there are 6 steps included on this handout. Number 1, pay attention. Number 2, reflect back. Number 3, read minds. And that's in quotes, and we will get into exactly what that means. And it is not what you think it means. Number 4, understand. Number 5, acknowledge the valid. And number 6, show equality. So, going into them in a little bit more detail, and we're just going to blitz right through these because I'm going to show you how I do it once we get to the recording. Number 1, pay attention. Look interested. Listen and observe. No multitasking. Make eye contact. That's not going to be relevant for me while I'm self-validating unless I'm standing in front of a mirror, though that's not the worst idea in the world. Okay, I'm going to put a pin in that. Back to the handout. Nod occasionally, respond with your face. Example, smile at happy statements, look concerned when hearing something painful. Like, this feels like a guide for someone who's autistic, and I appreciate it. Step 2, reflect back. Say back what you heard or observed to be sure you actually understand what the person is saying. No judgmental language or voice tone. Try to really get what the person feels and thinks. Have an open mind. No disagreeing, criticizing, or trying to change the person's mind or goals. Use a voice tone that allows the other person to correct you. And check the facts. Again, I'm not going to give examples here because we're going to get into it in a bit. Step 3, read minds. Be sensitive to what is not being said by the other person. Pay attention to facial expressions, body language, what is happening, and what you know about the person already. Show that you understand in words or by your actions. Be open to correction. Step 4, understand. Look for how the other person feels, is thinking, or if he or she is making sense, given the person's history, state of mind or body, or current events, i.e. the causes. Even if you don't approve of the person's behavior, or if his or her belief is incorrect. Say, it makes sense that you ... because ... Step 5, acknowledge the valid. Show that you see that the person's thoughts, feelings, or actions are valid, given current reality and facts. Act as if the person's behavior is valid. And step 6, show equality. Be yourself. Don't one-up or one-down the other person. Treat the other as an equal, not as fragile or incompetent. So, no suffering Olympics here. All right, now that we've done this, finally, the moment you've all been waiting for, we get to dive into the recording. And it's going to be a rough one, guys. I'm in a pretty low spot. I am 6 weeks into exposure. And if you want a good primer on what exposure is like, I explain it in great detail in episode 28. If you don't want to listen to the entire episode, go back and listen to like the first 20 minutes or half an hour where I explain the entire process of exposure. Long story short, I'm doing exposure to traumatic invalidation. And it is prolonged exposure. It's not like a one and done sort of thing. And the way I know it's prolonged is because I'm in December now, and I've been doing it since March. So we're coming up on 9 months. It just keeps on going. But yeah, so that's the context for what you're about to hear. Let's dive in. Past Joy, take it away. I don't know how to explain the degree of isolation that I'm experiencing right now. I literally know of no one. I haven't even heard of anybody who's done exposure. Not prolonged exposure. That's the distinction. I don't know a single person who's ever done it. And even if I did, I don't know that it would help, because the whole point of exposure is that it is catered specifically to the things that I avoid, so that I will learn to tolerate them and no longer avoid them, which means it is quite literally a hell designed exclusively for me. And it is so isolating. I feel so alone, and it's invisible. I don't know how to describe it to somebody. I mean, because it is stuff that is tailor-made for me. So it's stuff that I found invalidating. And I've told friends what I'm doing exposure to, the memories and the in vivo exposure I'm doing, and they're just kind of like, okay. Because it is not the thing that would light their nervous system on fire. It's the thing that lights my nervous system on fire. And it's so fucking isolating. Most of the time I accept that this is what I'm doing. And this is what I've chosen to do because I recognize that that I am stuck. That this experience of invalidation has stalled my life. Stalled out like a fucking car on the freeway. I get
sidelined by invalidation so badly that it takes me out of whatever I'm doing. It's like being teleported into another mindset, and it happens all the time. And it has gotten in the way of my romantic partnerships. It has gotten in the way of every job I've ever had. It's gotten in the way of my relating to my parents, and I can't keep letting it sideline me like this. So I am doing this thing to address it because I don't think it's reasonable to expect the world to bend for me. I don't think it's reasonable to expect that people go out of their way to avoid invalidating me. And even if it were reasonable for me to ask that of people, it happens anyway. Like we're imperfect. People are imperfect. We say and we do things that hurt each other, whether we mean to or not. And it is important that I not be completely demolished by that pain. So I'm doing this fucking thing so that I can relate to my parents again. I can be around them and not feel like a raw nerve. It's just on fire all the time. And they don't understand that. I mean, really, no one understands that. And it's fucking invisible. I feel invisible.
Future joy here. Let's validate past joy, shall we? So, recalling our steps here of how to validate. Pay attention, reflect back, read minds, understand, acknowledge the valid, and show equality. So, pay attention. It's hard for me to demonstrate to my past self that I'm paying attention because my past self can't see my face and see me nod along or whatever, so that one's not as applicable here. What I can do, though, is reflect back, and that's step number 2. So, here's what I heard. I heard a lot of things, and I jotted down a bunch of notes while I was listening to this so that I would make sure that I would cover all the main points here. I heard myself say the phrase, "It's a hell exclusively for me," which is a strong word choice, the use of the word hell, and that seems to indicate a significant amount of pain, distress, discomfort, and hopelessness. Hopelessness actually came up a lot. That's a theme that I keep noticing in a lot of the things that I was saying. I also heard a deep, deep longing to have someone to commiserate with about this. I heard myself say that I know literally no one. I've never even heard of anybody who has ever done exposure. And what I hear around that is that being alone in it, it's not necessarily the case that I'm the only person who's ever done it, but it occurs to me as though I am the only person who has ever done it. And that creates a lot of isolation. And there's also some tension because on the one hand, I heard myself say that I was longing for someone who can commiserate with me because they're also doing exposure. And on the other hand, acknowledging that my exposure will be completely and totally unique to me because it is based off of the things that I find invalidating. And it's based off of my own past experiences of the trauma that I've experienced around invalidation. So even if I did know somebody who's done exposure, that commiseration is only going to go so far. So there's some hopelessness there of like this huge longing, this deep, significant longing to have someone to commiserate with, and also a belief that it would be hopeless even if I did know somebody. I'm not convinced that it's actually true that that commiseration would be inadequate because someone else couldn't commiserate with the exact details. I think being able to commiserate with the experience of exposure, the experience of leaning into that feeling of avoidance, the experience of doing homework assignments, both imaginal and in vivo, having that camaraderie, I think would be significant. And I heard in the recording that I had the belief that that camaraderie would not be adequate. It wouldn't be enough, which of course would also engender hopelessness. Another thing I heard was frustration at feeling invisible, like all of the work that I was doing is invisible. There's no external signs that people can see. It's not like going to the gym and working out a ton and getting big and bulky, and people can go, oh my God, you look like you work out. I heard the frustration that there weren't external signifiers to the amount of work that I was doing. I also heard a frustration around my invalidations being specific to me, that when I share them with other people, they don't have the same reaction I have to those instances of invalidation. And what I'm realizing is that there's an underlying belief that other people's reaction to my invalidation, to my memories of invalidation, my experiences of invalidation, communicate to me the seriousness of those instances. Like, it's apparent that I will think something isn't a big deal if other people don't respond like it's a big deal. Like, if I told a friend, I had a car accident the other day, and they're like, oh, that's a bummer, versus I had a car accident the other day, and they're like, holy shit, are you okay? Like, I'm using other people's reactions as a way to validate my own experience and or invalidate my own experience, because clearly a lack of reaction in other people communicates to me that my experience isn't a big deal. These instances of invalidation are just not a big deal. And it occurs to me that this may not be an effective litmus test because those people aren't in my body while I'm experiencing what I'm experiencing. In the same way that we yell at horror movies and go like, why are you running up the stairs when you should be running out the front door? Because we're sitting on the couch eating popcorn or whatever, and we're armchair quarterbacks. Like, we don't actually know how we would respond if a knife-wielding psychopath was stalking us through our home, right? So other people's reaction to my trauma is not an effective litmus test for the seriousness of my trauma. And to validate what I was saying in the recording, it makes sense that I would seek out that validation, and that in not getting it, I would feel invalidated, which is what I was saying. I also heard the overwhelm of being sidelined by invalidation, like how much invalidation takes me out and stops me from being effective. And I also heard the hopelessness that I felt around addressing that, and the hopelessness around the interconnectedness of how invalidation is impacting me. Like, it's impacted every single facet of my life. Jobs, friendships, romantic partnerships, my relationship with my family, my relationship to myself, all of it. So I heard hopelessness in like, this is a huge thing. This is the elephant in the room. And I can't actually get anywhere that I want to get until this elephant in the room is escorted out of the room. I also heard a very strong commitment to wanting to find a way to survive this painful thing and to heal from the past painful things. Like, this is very important to me that I do this. So what did I just do here? Reflected back. I did do some mind reading because I was extrapolating some things. Like, I used the word hell. It's my own personal hell. Like, that seems to imply a seriousness, a level of pain, etc. I extrapolated around the interconnectedness of all of these different facets of my life that are being impacted. I extrapolated like all of the different adjectives I was using to glean that, okay, I'm feeling hopeless. That's what all of this is underneath everything else. Step 4 here is understand. Look for how the other person feels, is thinking, or if he or she is making sense given the person's history, state of mind or body, or current events. Even if you don't approve of the person's behavior or if his or her belief is incorrect. Say it makes sense that you ... because ... So let's do that. It makes sense that I feel hopeless because I cannot see a way out. I cannot see a way through, like past joy. I mean, I still experience this hopelessness around healing from invalidation right now, but let's talk about past joy. So it makes sense that I felt hopeless because one of the things that happens when I do this work is I get a really clear picture of exactly where I'm at. I get a clear understanding of, oh, here are the thoughts that are running, and here are the patterns of behaviors that are running. And the analogy that I use most frequently in exposure is that it feels like being handed a satellite photograph of myself floating out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Like, it's really useful to know my exact location, and oh fuck, I'm floating in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. That's not relieving. That's not soothing. And the more I am aware of how much invalidation impacts me, it makes sense that I would feel hopeless about that because I don't yet have skills to deal with that invalidation. It's just a lot of awareness without any way to address my position. So it makes sense that I felt hopeless because I had a really clear understanding of exactly where I was and no method, no roadmap to get out of where I was. Step 5 here is acknowledge the valid. Show that you see the person's thoughts, feelings, or actions are valid given current reality and facts. Everything I just said, it makes sense that I had all of those thoughts and that I had all of those feelings. I don't have to say that it is factually accurate that my thoughts point to the truth and that my feelings point to the truth. But I can say that everything I was thinking and everything I was feeling makes sense and comes from somewhere and is caused. And to listen to that with that underlying assumption that, okay, this makes sense. If I can't see how it makes sense, it doesn't make it less valid. It just means I can't see how right now. And then the final step here is show equality. Be yourself. Don't one up or one down the other person. Treat the other as an equal, not as fragile or incompetent. So this is what not to do, because this is a recording from, I think, week 6 of exposure, and I'm in month 9 now. And so I could be an asshole and be like, oh, past joy, you thought it was bad then? Little do you know, you have no idea how much worse it's going to get. That's not validating. So to acknowledge where past joy was in that moment without invalidating where I am now. And if I were talking to somebody else, to acknowledge where they're at without invalidating where I am at is kind of key here. And so I would say, of course you feel like shit. You're 6 weeks into exposure. Like, it's not easy. Like, if I were being an asshole, I'd want to go, really? You're only 6 weeks in and you're already complaining? Come talk to me when you've been doing this for almost a year. That's invalidating. The whole point of exposure is to build tolerance to remembering things, to build tolerance to emotion, to build tolerance to thoughts, all of this shit. And early on, I didn't have tolerance. So of course, it's going to feel very, very painful. And it's not fair of me to compare past joy 6 weeks in to present joy. Like, my experience now of exposure is very different than it was at 6 weeks. And of course it would be. And I think of it a lot, I've compared it to like growing calluses. Like, if you start playing guitar, your fingers are going to feel like they're shredded. And if you go slowly and little by little, you can build up calluses, and your ability to tolerate guitar playing becomes better and better, and you can tolerate playing for longer and longer time periods. So a seasoned veteran of like 50 years of guitar playing turning to a fifth grader who's just picking up their first guitar and being like, stop complaining. You've barely begun to scratch the surface of finger pain. That's not validating. It doesn't acknowledge that fifth grader's experience is different. And past joy at 6 weeks is different than 9-month joy. So I want to validate that, of course, I was having all of this pain and isolation come up because I was brand new to this thing again. And I was also comparing, like, I didn't say this in the recording, but I think this is what was going on. I was comparing the beginning of exposure to the end of the last time I did exposure. The last time I did exposure 6 years ago, I was doing it to the trauma of rape. And by the time I was done doing exposure, I was unfuckwithable. I'm like, let's talk about it. I can tell you my entire story. It doesn't really faze me anymore. And I, of course, was comparing that point, that experience, that end, to the beginning and going, what the fuck is wrong with me that I'm having these freakouts over something that I know how to do? Well, each exposure is different, and traumatic invalidation is a different beast than being raped multiple times. It just is. So I want to validate that that I was feeling overwhelmed by all the feelings that were coming up. And I wasn't acknowledging the ways in which this exposure is different from the past exposure. And of course, comparing those two things and finding my newer situation to be wanting or lacking in some way, of course that would result in frustration. Of course that would result in hopelessness and overwhelm. Yeah. Okay. Back to the recording.
I was doing my exposure today to the first memory that I've been working on, which is my dad telling me when we were having a conversation about the fear that I had, the realization that I had that I didn't know how to prevent future sexual assaults from happening. I'd had that thought and was like, oh, fuck, I need to talk about this. So I'm talking to my dad about it, and he said at some point in the conversation, he was giving me a bunch of safety tips. And at some point he said, if you leave your car unlocked in a bad part of town, and it sounds so fucking like stupid. I'm judging myself that was one of those memories that I was just like, oh, fuck. And diving into it and doing exposure to it feels like lighting myself on fire. And one of the interesting things about exposure is that prolonged exposure, specifically, is that it isn't necessarily about having a smaller, less painful emotional response. It's practicing tolerating really strong emotional responses. So I'm tracking, what I think the worst thing that could happen while I'm doing my exposure is going to be. How bad would it be if it happened? How likely is it to happen? Did it actually happen? I'm tracking my urges, like suicidal ideation, self-harm ideation, and dissociation, and my SUDs, my subjective units of distress, before, during, and after. And then I'm tracking my emotions, the big 10, I think it is, before and after. And the emotions aren't going down. It's not like doing exposure is building up like immunity to it. It still hurts. And basically what I'm training my body is that, hey, we can hurt this bad, we can hurt this much, and still be okay. And I have done this already. I spent 6 months doing it in 2017, 2 memories of my first adult rape, and I know it works. I know that it is effective. I trust that it is effective. I trust that it is working. I know that it is going to feel so much worse before it even begins to glimmer getting better. I know that right now, the pain I'm feeling is nothing compared to the pain that is coming. And I'm doing this with support. I have my therapist. I have my therapy group. We're doing it by the book. And I think it's good. And it still fucking sucks. It sucks, and it sucks to be doing it alone. And I'm not. I fucking hate group work. I hate teamwork. My happy place is alone in my closet with my laptop. I do not have words for how much more effective I am when I am working alone. I much prefer to work alone. And there's something, it's not that I want to be doing exposure with a person so much as like, it would just be lovely to know that, to have somebody else who gets it. Because right now, 100% of my interactions about it are me explaining it to someone. And that is work. And it's never enough. It's never accurate enough. It's never putting somebody exactly in my shoes.
Alrighty, Future Joy back again. I'm going to keep going over this how-to guide. Number 1, pay attention. Number 2, reflect back. Number 3, read minds. Number 4, understand. Number 5, acknowledge the valid. And number 6, show equality. So, paying attention, I was doing that while I was listening to the recording, and now I'm going to reflect back. I heard myself say, it sounds stupid that the memory was invalidating to me. It feels stupid that this thing was traumatic for me. And if I had the thought that it was stupid to be invalidated by what my dad said, then of course I'm going to feel like shit because I'm judging myself for having the emotions and the thoughts that I had. And self-judgments trigger shame. That's what self-judgments do. And shame triggers self-judgments. So of course I would get into this self-judgment shame spiral. And I watched myself tee it up. It's like putting all the dominoes together. And I'm like, oh, I see. You're going to hit that first one. And once you hit that first one, all of the rest of this is going to happen automatically. Like there's no other outcome to self-judgment other than to end up in a shame spiral. And there, of course, are things I could insert into that to stop it. In the same way that, like, if somebody pushes that first domino down, I could 200 feet forward, grab 3 dominoes out, and it'll stop, once it reaches that gap that I've created. So there's skills to add to it. But left to my own devices, I start self-judging, I'm going to end up in a shame spiral. I also said the phrase, it feels like lighting myself on fire. So doing step 3 here of reading minds, that sounds like a lot of fucking pain, like a lot of pain. And it's, I think, telling that I say it's like lighting myself on fire instead of hitting my thumb with a hammer. Hitting my thumb with a hammer, that seems like something that I would do accidentally in the process of trying to do something else. Lighting myself on fire has no other purpose other than to light myself on fire. And so I think I'm hearing underneath that, in my analogy choice, the belief that I'm doing this painful thing for the sake of doing a painful thing. Like I'm not really connected to the bigger picture of what this is going to do for me long term. And I also noticed myself say, I've done this already. I know that it works. I trust that it's effective. And when I was saying all of that, it was kind of like, it felt like a throwaway comment, like, yeah, I know it works and I know it's effective and I've done it before, so I know how it's going to go. Those felt like very dismissive. Like those weren't sources of hope or validation to me. It felt like I was saying those things as a way of being like, you should be in a different emotional space, Joy, because you know how this goes and you know that it's going to work. So stop complaining. Like I was using that as a way to invalidate myself and to judge where I was at emotionally. And where I was at emotionally was that I was experiencing a lot of pain and didn't really have a lot of hope around what my life could look like once I'm done. And that's a key distinction here also with exposure this time compared to the last time I did it. The last time I did it, I had a before picture in my mind, like what I could go back to. I remembered what it was like to go to the gym and not feel anxious. I remembered what it was like to have sex with people and not dissociate. So that was like a kind of a shining light, a northern star, something to aim for. Oh, I could get those parts of my life back. Whereas with invalidation, I don't have a before. There is no before. Like my earliest memories are of age 7, with one exception. I remember an earthquake that happened when I was 6. But I don't remember like my early childhood. So I certainly don't remember a before, like before invalidation started happening, because invalidation has been happening for as long as I can remember. So I don't have a clear, like guiding light, I guess. I'm like, oh, this is what my life could look like. I'm actually relying very heavily on other people's hope. Like my therapist keeps saying, I think it's possible for you to find a job that doesn't make you hate your life. And I'm like, okay, you can have that thought. I'll let you hold that belief because I'm unable to hold that belief. Like for me, work is invalidating. They're the same thing. If I'm working, I'm being invalidated. And my therapist is asserting that that is not always the case, that it's not a one-to-one relationship. And I don't have that hope. So it makes sense that I would sound hopeless because I sounded hopeless. And having done this before, I knew kind of like, it's like strapping into a roller coaster that you've been in already. I know how this goes. I know that it is going to get a lot worse before it gets better. And so the pain that I was experiencing then at 6 weeks in was also, it was overwhelming. And then there was the additional overwhelm of realizing this is not the low point yet. It is going to get lower. And of course, like being in pain and looking into the future and seeing even worse pain, of course, that would be hopelessness inducing. So it makes sense. Here's step 4. Understand, it makes sense that I would feel hopeless because I was in a very low point and anticipating even lower points. It makes sense that I was feeling hopeless because I didn't have, and I still don't really have actually, a vision of what could be possible if I healed from this traumatic invalidation. Like, what could my life look like? And I also heard myself say that I wanted to be doing it with somebody else, or at least be able to commiserate with somebody else, because the work of explaining what exposure is like is exhausting. And it is. Explaining an experience that is largely subjective is incredibly exhausting. It's not like, oh, here I am in pain because I hit my thumb with a hammer, and now I can demonstrate to you what that feels like by hitting your thumb with a hammer. Like, there's no way to do that. There's no way to recreate my experience for somebody else so that they fully get it. And that means that I'm reliant on finding ways to explain what my experience is like, and it feels painful to explain. It is work to explain. And I heard myself say that it's never enough. My explanation is never enough. It's never accurate enough to really put somebody else in my shoes. And of course it wouldn't be. And so I'm also hearing a lack of acceptance that that is the human experience, that nobody else can ever fully be in my shoes. Even my sisters who have the same parents as I do, we do not have the same experience of our parents, even though there's a lot of overlap. But it's not a one-to-one, and there's enough differences that our experiences are very different. There's a lot of overlap that I have with other queer people about being queer, and there's still differences. There's a lot of overlap that I have with autistic people about being autistic, and there's still differences. And even when I find people who are queer and autistic and also part of my family, there are still differences. So I was hearing a longing for that not to be the case, and a lack of acceptance that that's the case. That having other people, if I'm seeking understanding from other people, that it will require a certain amount of work on my part. And given how emotionally wrung out I was, it makes sense that I would not want to do that work, that I would not have the energy to give to that work. So that makes sense. And showing equality here, I understand explaining is fucking work. It is one of the key features, the things that I love about having a podcast, because I can explain something once, like episode 28. I spend the first 20 or 30 minutes of episode 28 explaining what exposure therapy is, and I never have to do that again. I can give little like tidbits and stuff, but every episode where I'm going to talk about exposure, I can just say, go listen to the first 20 minutes of episode 28. Done and done. Because I really don't like repeating myself. I really don't like having to do the work of going into my brain and finding those analogies and distilling it down. And it's so much fucking work. And it hurts my brain. Like it hurts on a foundational bone deep level. If my brain had bones, it would be that deep. So yeah, I get the desire to not want to have to explain. Okay. Back to the recording.
And I already have the experience of feeling other most of the time. I already have the experience of not knowing how to explain myself. It's not the words he said, if you leave your car unlocked in a bad part of town. It's not the words my dad said. It was the experience of going to him with something that I was scared about. And being very aware of how much he didn't get it, how little he understood what I was trying to tell him. And then on top of that, the anticipation of judgment if I wasn't helped by what he said, that I would be seen as stubbornly negative, as resistant, as willful, as unteachable. And it was like I was ingesting poison, and he was telling me, don't be poisoned by this thing. I'm not poisoning you. And it was on me to process the poison, to figure out a way to get it out of my body. And it was also my responsibility to find an antidote, all while being poisoned. Just this intense, intense isolation of drowning and not having any way to call for help in a way that people would understand. There is a My Favorite Murder episode at the podcast where one of the hosts is telling a story of two Mexican fishermen who left the west coast of Mexico to go fishing for the day. And a storm came up and they were blown out to sea and their engine was swamped and they had no way of getting back. And they were adrift in the Pacific Ocean, just the two of them in a glorified rowboat. And they survived for a while, catching fish and collecting rainwater, and then one of them died, and the other was still adrift for over a year in the Pacific Ocean. And that's bad enough, right? All of that's bad enough. All of that would be reason enough to get out of the boat and just wait until death took you. But here's the worst part of this story is at one point he's getting closer to land. He doesn't know that, but he is drifting all the way across the Pacific Ocean to towards Malaysia, I think. And at one point a boat appears on the horizon and the boat is headed right for him. And he sees the boat and the boat sees him and he is waving and jumping up and down and gesticulating. And the boat sees him and keeps going. He's been at sea for over a year, and they thought he was waving at them. They waved back. And I heard that, and I was like, oh, okay. Because, my experience of mental health is a lot like that. What do I have to do? How do I have to look in order for people to believe me when I say, this is my experience, this is how I feel? I still don't have an answer. Both times I've been severely suicidal. I've gone to the ER and they have sent me home. After one night, they've sent me home. And I went home and I turned around a few hours later and went straight back. And the isolation, the abandoning, the abject despair of being that low and telling somebody, going to the people you're told to go to. You're supposed to go to the ER. That's what you're supposed to do. That's the safe thing to do, to go and get help. And there's a unique kind of despair of going there. And having them tell you, oh, you're not in bad enough shape for us to admit you. Waving at another boat. Oh my God, they see me. And they just wave back.
Future joy here again. I'm actually kind of hitting a stride here, which is nice because I have been putting off doing this, the recording the validation part of this commentary for days. I didn't mention this earlier. The commentary I did before we got into the recording, I recorded that 4 days ago and didn't want to do this part of actually validating myself, but I'm kind of hitting a stride and it's not as painful or as hard as I was expecting it to be. Because a lot of it's well, yeah, Joy, of course you'd have that experience, which is, I guess, progress or something. So reflecting back what I heard myself talk about the traumatic thing was not the words that my dad said. It was the whole experience of going to him for help around a thing that I was scared about. And then him meeting me with fixing, common sense safety tips. And common sense is in huge quotes here. And then also the preemptive concern about how he would react to me not being fixed by his fixing. Because my dad he started calling me stubbornly negative. I actually don't remember when that started. He would offer help if I was having a strong emotional reaction. I think a lot of it was autistic meltdowns, actually, where I was having a nervous system overwhelm, and his help wasn't helping. He was trying to fix the straw that broke the camel's back because that was what he could see. He's like, oh, Joy's having a meltdown over a grilled cheese sandwich. Let's fix the grilled cheese sandwich. But what I've learned now from Purple, Ella, and Coco, I have put the link to her TikTok in the description, is that a tantrum is ineffective communication around a need. And once that need is met, the tantrum stops. Whereas an autistic meltdown is the result of nervous system overwhelm. And it is not stopped by, quote, solving the trigger. And my dad didn't know that, and I didn't know that. But he was seeking to understand why I was having the reaction that I was having. And here I am validating my dad. But the impact that that had of him labeling me this way, the result of that was that he would write me off. He's like, oh, Joy's in one of her moods, and nothing I can say will help. And as a kid, being met with that was really fucking shitty. Like, I'm going to my dad, the person who's supposed to help, and he's not helping me. In fact, he's writing me off. He's throwing up his hands. He's giving up on me. And it was also shitty as an adult to have that happen. And I didn't know at the time of the memory that I'm talking about. So this is like 3 steps of past joy removed. Past joy was talking about a memory that was passed to her. In the memory, the original memory, I didn't know I had autism. I didn't know what my meltdowns were. I just knew that I had them. And I knew that it felt bad that my dad called me stubbornly negative. And it didn't feel correct to me. Like, it didn't feel like an accurate labeling of me. And I knew it was something to avoid. And I knew it was something I was scared of. By the time I recorded the recording, so past joy, 7 months ago, I'd seen the man behind the curtain. I saw the mechanisms running. So at that point, I suspected, I hadn't been diagnosed yet, but I suspected I had autism. And I was aware of the impact of him labeling me that way and calling me stubbornly negative. And in telling the memory, relating the memory, I wanted to avoid that. I knew that in the memory, I wanted to avoid him saying I was being stubbornly negative. And so if I'm using the reading minds step here, it's like walking a minefield. Of course I would be fucking stressed out. Like, I went to him for help, and if I wasn't helped by his help, he was going to abandon me and judge me. And so of course I would be attached to finding just the right way to convince him, just the right way to explain it to him. And of course I would use the analogy, it's like being poisoned and then also being responsible for finding the antidote. What a fucking impossible situation, like being between a rock and a hard place. Like, of course I wasn't going to be able to navigate that. On top of also having an extreme emotional reaction to the knowledge that I could just continue to be sexually assaulted. Like, all of this was happening simultaneously in the original memory. Oh, what a clusterfuck. Like, what an impossible situation. I also heard myself mention the intense isolation of drowning and not having a way to call for help in a way that people understand. So this is really important that I specify that, because I do have a way to call for help. I did have a way in the original memory. I had a way to call for help. I could go talk to my dad. But the problem is I didn't have a way that I could talk to him where he would understand me. And this is one of the fucking nightmares of autism, is that there is the appearance that we are speaking the same language. Like, we're both speaking English. We're both speaking like common vernacular English. We are using grammar structures each of us understand. We're using words, like I'm using words he knows the definition to. He's using words that I know the definition to. Like, on the surface, we are communicating. It all looks correct. So why the fuck isn't it working? Of course I would feel frustrated. Of course I would feel just abject despair about this. And of course, it is being added to by the knowledge that my dad will translate his lack of understanding of me into me being fundamentally bad. Him labeling me stubbornly negative, like, There are two things my dad has talked about at length, two things that are really, really bad: being stubborn and being negative. Like, my dad is an optimist, and he really does not like negativity, and he has talked about that at length. He's also talked about how much he dislikes stubbornness, and he put those two things together. And because I think he must have been assuming that if he were saying the things that I was saying, his motivation would be a stubborn adherence to negativity. Like, if he was doing what I was doing and focusing on what I was focusing on, he would be motivated by a stubborn negativity. That would be the cause behind that behavior if he were doing that behavior. He didn't know that I had autism. I didn't know that I had autism. So he was labeling it according to what he knew and writing me off in the process. So I was screaming for help that I was drowning, and he could hear that I was saying words, and he could understand the words that I was saying, and it didn't compute. The story that I told of the two fishermen at sea, a couple corrections there. I first heard that story in a My Favorite Murder podcast episode 310, and I've linked it in the description. I also said that the two fishermen were Mexican, which is not accurate. They set sail from Mexico, but only the fisherman who died was actually Mexican. The two men were Mexican fisherman Ezequiel Cordoba, who died of starvation after 4 months at sea, and then also Salvadoran fisherman Jose Salvador Alvarenga. And Jose is the one who drifted across the Pacific from the west coast of Mexico to the Marshall Islands. I said Malaysia in the recording, but he didn't make it quite that far. He was at sea for a total of 13 months, 9 of them alone, on an open little boat. I didn't spend nearly enough time focusing on this in the recording. Like, he was adrift in the middle of the fucking ocean for over a year, 9 months of which was spent alone. So first off, like, that is a bonkers story. Like, actually sitting with what that would feel like is, yeah, awful. And it says something that is the analogy that I use. And ever since I heard that episode, I've been using that analogy to describe my experience, especially the part where he called for help. A boat saw him and he called for help. He was waving his arms and calling for help. And they saw him too and waved back and kept going. This is a man who's been adrift at that point for over a year. How much more in dire straits could he have looked? How much more could he have performed, I am dying slowly, please help me? And like, my experiences of going to the ER and being turned away, like, that is, I used the phrase in the recording, the abject despair. I mentioned feeling abandoned. I mentioned feeling isolated. But the abject despair of going to the people who you're told to go to for help and having them turn you away. Of course I would feel despair. Of course I would. Of course I would feel despair around knowing that I could just keep being sexually assaulted. And I did continue to be sexually assaulted. When I started exposure, I'd only been raped as an adult once. And then, like, 3 or 4 weeks into exposure, I was raped 3 more times by 3 different people on 3 different days. And then again 3 or 4 months after that. And then I wasn't for a while, and that was a nice change of pace. All of that was in 2017. And then in 2019, on a first date with a guy, it happened again. And it kind of sucks. Like, it sucks to know that it is possible that it could keep happening. And it sucks to try to talk about that with somebody who doesn't want to acknowledge that it could just keep happening. I mean, it's gotta be shit as a dad to be like, oh, my daughter keeps getting raped. I don't want to acknowledge that it could just keep happening. Let's see what I can do to prevent it from happening. Of course he's going to try to fix. But what he wasn't doing in trying to fix was getting my experience. I'm sure he was having his own experience. I'm sure he was having his own emotional reaction to the knowledge that this could keep happening. And it wasn't helpful at all. Okay. Back to the recording.
So these conversations with my dad, isn't it fucking scary, Dad? Isn't it terrifying? The re-victimization rates If you're robbed, you are like 9 times more likely to be robbed again. If your house is burglarized, you're like something like 11 times more likely to be burglarized again. If you're sexually assaulted, you are 35 times more likely to be sexually assaulted again. It's fucking scary. And not leaving my drinks uncovered and not walking to my car late at night and not going home with strange men and having this list of rules doesn't make me feel any safer. But I have to be helped by this. Otherwise, I'm stubborn and willful and unteachable. Like, just the isolation of talking about how scared I am about a thing and having it go completely pear-shaped. And all of these autism spectrum disorder assessments that I've been doing, on the one hand, they're incredibly validating. I'm like, oh, finally somebody is able to describe what it feels like inside my head. And on the other hand, it is just it's still so isolating. I still feel so alone. I still don't know how to describe my experience in a way that would have other people get it. Other people who have not had the same experience. Because it's like a bunch of things all tied up together, right? I know that there are people who had bits and pieces of my experience, and there is zero chance that there is a person in the world who has had every single same experience as me, because there's as many unique experiences as there are people in the world. So it's not, I don't have an expectation that there's someone out there who would get every single thing. I just would really, really, really love to have the experience of telling somebody, hey, this is how I feel, and have them go, oh, okay, sure. Have I ever felt that way? No. But if that's what you say your experience is, I believe you. And I am constantly looking for just the right argument. I am constantly searching for exactly the right words that will finally have someone believe me on the first try. And the problem is, it's different for every person I talk to. Different analogies work for each person, different explanations, different word choices. It's all different. And it's still so much fucking work. And I am resentful of it. I don't want to do it anymore. I don't want to explain to people how it feels like inside me. I don't want to have to put in all of that work to still have a subpar experience because they still don't fully understand it. It's all this work for just a little bit of extra validation. And I am not convinced it is worth it. And what is missing in all of this is acceptance. I am very much wanting my parents to understand me because I love them and I enjoy them, and I don't know, do I need a reason? It would just be nice, right? Isn't that kind of like an innate human desire to have the people who raised you accept you? I don't know what my point in all of this is, but I was just very overwhelmed for a bit there with how singular my experience is, and how I don't have anybody to share it with, anybody to process it with. There's not a lot of people who believe me, and I can feel it. I can feel it when I say something about how I operate on the inside, how life feels like to me on the inside. I can feel when somebody doesn't believe it. And they're like, pat you on the head and go, oh, okay. Well, she doesn't really know her own mind. That can't possibly be accurate. She's being hyperbolic. She's being contrary. She's being stubbornly negative. I don't know how to explain what decades of that messaging, how that feels on the inside. The only analogy that I've come up with that I like is, the Iron Maiden, the torture device, which was basically like a sarcophagus in the shape of a human that had all these metal spikes inside it. And you would put the person you wanted to kill inside and then shut it. And it was like, being impaled on all sides by all of these spikes. And my experience kind of going through life is that I'm in one of those, and I have found there is an exactly joy-shaped void inside, perfectly fit. I have found exactly where to stand so that none of the spikes are poking me. And then anytime I interact with someone else and they try to fix, help, make suggestions, oh, you should do this, you should get this job, you should do this thing, it's like they're yanking my arm and they're pulling me into the spikes. And I'm reacting with, hey, no, I don't want to go in that direction. I'm giving feedback that this is painful, that this doesn't work for me. And so the person pulls in a different direction. I'm like, okay, well, you're pulling me into spikes over there too. And the thing is, I have found exactly where to stand so that I'm not being impaled on these spikes. And I'm trying to explain what it feels like. And you're so pessimistic, Joy. You don't want to have hope. You don't want to see the possibilities. You're like just firmly entrenched in seeing all of the negatives.
Future Joy here again. So, quick correction. I mentioned re-victimization rates. Being robbed once makes you 9 times more likely than the general population to be robbed in the future. I got that stat correct. Being burglarized once makes you 4 times more likely than the general population to be burglarized in the future. I said 11 times in the recording. That's incorrect. The correct stat is 4 times. And I've linked my sources in the description. I did get the sexual assault rate correct. Being sexually assaulted once makes you 35 times more likely to be sexually assaulted again than the general population. So that's fun. Okay, so getting back to validation here, reflecting back what I heard that I was scared. I was scared about this knowledge that sexual assaults could just keep happening to me. I felt really, really scared about this, and I went looking for help. And my dad didn't know how to help. He thought he knew how to help. I also heard that I had the thought that I had to be helped by his help. I had the thought that I had to be teachable. I had the thought that if I weren't helped, if I weren't teachable, that he would judge me. And of course, that would elicit frustration. Of course, having those thoughts would elicit frustration. And of course, those thoughts are caused by something and come from somewhere. I didn't just manifest them out of thin air. I also heard myself talk about the isolation of, I use the word isolation a lot. The isolation of my experience of feeling really, really afraid and going for help and then not being helped. That example with the guy in the boat, it really is am I not being clear here? Have I not explained well enough? I think about scenes in horror movies where somebody calls the cops and they're covered in their own blood and they're like, I've been attacked. And the cops are like, but have you? Why don't we book you instead? We're going to assume that you're the problem. I also hear, I keep using the word isolation in the recording, but I'm also going to add to that, reading minds here, that there's some degree of crazy making, feeling crazy, going to someone for help about a thing that is really clear, this is a big deal and I need help around it, and being met with not help. It's I don't know how to be more clear than I am currently being. I am perplexed by your reaction. Is it me? Am I the problem? So, given that was my experience, of course I would feel frustrated. Of course. I also heard myself say that I still didn't know how to describe my experience in a way that other people will get it. And I heard a lot of frustration around that. Not having language, not having a way to explain. A lot of isolation, of course. I said in the recording that I didn't have the expectation that anyone would ever fully, completely understand me all the way down to the nitty-gritty. And I heard a longing that I still be believed. Even if people don't understand it, I still want to be believed. I want to be able to say, hey, this is my experience, and have someone go, okay, yeah. That feels like a very simple thing, and yet it doesn't happen all that often. So that's a deep, underlying longing to be believed. I also mentioned in the recording constantly looking for exactly the right argument to explain myself on the first try, and the frustration that that exact right argument is different for every person. That's a lot of work to figure out what analogies and what explanation will work to have someone understand me. I heard a lot of resentment about that experience. I heard a lot of resentment that it took that much work, like a lack of acceptance around that. I kept saying over and over, it's all this work. And that to me communicates two things. First off, a ton of work, but also very low capacity to do that work. Because there's things I've done in my life that are a lot of work. Yup, it's a lot of work. And I'm only hopeless about the amount of work if it's not something I have capacity to do. If it's a lot of work and I have the capacity to do it, it's just okay, yeah, let's do it. Let's get started. So underneath this, fuck, it's so much work, is also an exhaustion, a belief that I didn't have the capacity to do that work. And also not believing that all that work will even be worth it. Like I mentioned in the recording, that I could do all of that work and get just a tiny little bit of validation in return. My return on investment is not high. That's the belief that I had, that all of this work for what? For crumbs, right? And I hear that I think I would have been okay with doing that amount of work if I were confident that it would actually yield results. And so I also had an underlying belief that all that work would not yield results, and it would just be a huge amount of work for nothing, or for very, very little. I also heard a very deep, abiding longing to have my parents understand me, and a lack of acceptance that they don't. And of course, I would want my parents to understand me. I think that's, like I said in the recording, a basic human desire is to have our caregivers understand us, accept us. So of course I would feel upset about that. That's step 4 of validation here. Understand. Say, it makes sense that you ... because ... It makes sense that I would long to have my parents understand me, because I am a person, and that's something people want, to have our caregivers understand us. And it makes sense that I feel frustration and heartbreak. I heard a lot of sadness. It came out as frustration, but I think underneath it all, there's a lot of sadness, which is step 3 there, reading minds, going beyond the exact words that I was saying. There's a really strong longing to be understood, and a lot of sadness that I'm not. I also heard a concern. I expressed a concern about being labeled as hyperbolic or contrary or stubbornly negative, and that decades of that messaging have impacted me. I am really aversive to those labels. I worry about that. I remember my first DBT group when we were talking about how all behavior is caused, and I laughed at my instructor, and he was like, say more about this reaction. And I said, my behavior doesn't make sense. My behavior isn't caused. My emotions come from nothing. I'm hysterical. I'm unreasonable. I'm illogical. I'm all of these really awful, gender-coded words. And my DBT instructor was like, where did you get that messaging from? But I really worry about it. I really worry about being called hysterical, being called contrary, being called hyperbolic, I'm exaggerating. I really want to avoid that. Because I think part of the problem with being accused of exaggerating, that requires me to go and find all my data so that I can prove that I'm not. And finding all that data is a lot of work. The last thing I mentioned in the clip we just heard is that I was talking about the Iron Maiden torture device, which is not a torture device. If you put somebody inside one of those things, they're going to die. So it's not a way to torture someone, it's a way to kill them. But I talked about how it's not helpful for people to be like, oh, come this way, and they're pulling me into spikes, and I say, ouch, and they say, oh, well, we'll pull you this other way, and they pull me into more spikes, and I say, ouch. Really, it's not that I want to find the least painful way to get out of it. I want help removing the spikes. Like, I want help removing the things that are causing pain, I guess. And instead, I have the experience that when I talk about the pain, I'm told that I'm stubbornly negative. Clearly, I have a very large wound about having been labeled stubbornly negative because I keep bringing that up with a lot of anger, a lot of frustration, and I think underneath all of it, a lot of heartache. Okay, back to the recording for our last clip.
And the other problem I have is I don't have the ability to imagine something that I haven't seen before. I can't fathom a work environment where I could be paid commensurate with what value I bring and could be allowed to do my work at my own pace, which is incredibly fast, but I could do it alone. I could chug it out. I wouldn't have to sit and take up time filling a chair because I'm supposed to be there for 8 hours a day or whatever bullshit. I could get my work done. I would have access to the questions that I need answered so that I could effectively sprint, and I would get paid for it, and I would have accommodations. I wouldn't have to work in collaboration with anyone else, and would be valued, not just paid lip service to, but actually shown that I was valued, paid what I'm worth, trusted to know what I need to do in order to effectively do my job, and left alone to do it. I don't know what that would be like. I can't fathom it. And there's all of these people, like this person who is authentically themselves and they have a job being authentically themselves. But they're performing, they're speaking in front of people, they're working in collaboration with others, and I don't want to do any of that. And I have seen 0 examples of what it could look like. So my inability to picture that and to believe that it exists is not because I'm fucking stubbornly negative. It's because I can't actually picture it. I don't believe it exists. It's a flaw of imagination. It's a thing I do not have. I don't know how to have. And if it turns out that I do have autism, that's a possibility that it is something I cannot have. But it's incredibly frustrating to have these conversations. My dad tries to cheer me up without actually understanding why I feel upset. My favorite thing that any therapist has ever said to me, my first dbt-pe, my first prolonged exposure therapist, said, "You're not allowed to offer advice until you've demonstrated you understand the full scope of the problem." And there's this gendered thing of like, men want to fix and women just want to be heard. And I call bullshit that splits along gender lines. And that's certainly also very heteronormative. But like, I'm not opposed to problem solving and wanting to fix what's going on. But the thing is, if we're going to fix it, I want to fix what the actual problem is, not the problem that whoever just jumping in and taking 2 seconds to ask a question, whatever the problem they think it is, that's not what the fucking problem is. It's bullshit. It's always so superficial. That is not the actual problem. And my refusal to take advice from somebody who hasn't demonstrated that they understand the full scope of my problem, my refusal to take their advice is not me being fucking stubbornly negative. If I go into a doctor and I'm sitting on the exam table and they come in and they say, "Okay, well, we think you have bronchitis." And I'm like, "You haven't even talked to me yet." I'm like, "Okay, fine, we'll ask one question. How do you feel?" I'm like, "Well, I have a sore throat." "Okay, great. Then we think you have bronchitis." Would anyone trust this doctor? Like, that's bullshit. No. And even if the doctor is, by some magical phenomenon, a sorcerer of some kind that can divine physical ailments just by looking at me, I don't know that about that doctor. So even if the doctor does fully understand and has x-ray vision and can look at my lungs and can look at my blood and can look at my pathogen levels and my platelets and all these other things by just x-ray vision, he hasn't told me, or she, excuse me, they haven't told me, the doctor has not told me that that is what they're skilled at. So as far as I know, they have just come in and said, yeah, you have bronchitis. But they have not demonstrated to me that they actually understand the full scope of my problem. They have to demonstrate it. I'm very angry. I'm very angry about the amount of work I'm doing to heal, to function, to not be constantly sidelined by fucking invalidation, and it's invisible. It's invisible. Nobody's there when I'm doing it. And even if they were, they wouldn't understand why the recordings I'm listening to, why those are invalidating to me. Because it's tailor-made to me. I just would love to talk to somebody who understood. Talk to somebody who's done it. That is like, oh yeah, yep, had all those feelings, had all those thoughts. It fucking blows. Because it does, it fucking blows. And I'm clear that ultimately the skill to use, there's some radical acceptance to be done around accepting that my parents can't understand what I'm going through. There's some radical acceptance that really no one can fully understand what I'm going through. And some practice of self-validation, practice accepting that my experience is valid even if no one else can ever fully understand it or validate it. Okay, I'm done talking.
Future Joy here again, and that was the end of the recording, so we're on the home stretch here. A couple things that I want to reflect back. I mentioned my inability to imagine something that I haven't seen before or experienced before. I think part of that is an autism thing. I think part of that is also a trauma thing, especially early childhood trauma. One of the symptoms of having early childhood trauma is the sense of foreshortened future, like the belief that you're not going to live all that long. And I think that kind of part and parcel with that is the experience of just not imagining, because why bother? So, yeah, I have a hard time picturing things if I haven't seen them modeled for me. And I mentioned that there are a lot of examples of people out in the world who are autistic and introverted, who are fully themselves and make a living being fully themselves. But they're people like Hannah Gadsby, who makes a living on stage. I'm like, I don't want to do that. Where are my examples of people who just work in a closet and do data entry and are left alone? Well, people who do that, they're not having Netflix specials produced about them, and they're not getting books written about them. So there's a sampling error on my part. I mentioned also the stereotype that men want to fix and women want to be heard, and I said that was really heteronormative. I used the wrong word there. It's very binary, is what I meant. It assumes a binary of gender, and that there are only two, and that men are one way and that women are a different way. And it doesn't even acknowledge the existence of non-binary people. I heard a lot of frustration. I heard a ton of frustration around people trying to fix the wrong problem. Like people not actually listening to what the real underlying problem is, but instead fixing what they think the problem is. Like a huge amount of anger came up there. And I think step 4 of validation is understand, and seeing how a person's behavior makes sense given their history. And I have a very long history of people, specifically my dad, but also a lot of other people trying to fix what they think the problem is and not listening to me when I try to explain what the underlying problem is. So that's decades. That's almost 40 years of frustration coming up right there. Decades and decades of frustration. So of course I would feel that angry and that hopeless and that just discouraged. Of course I would feel that way. How else could I possibly feel? God damn. I also expressed a lot of anger at people labeling me, again, specifically my dad, but he's not the only one, labeling me as being problematic for not being helped by their help. And there's a lot of indignation there. There's a lot of it feels very unjust. It feels very unfair. I have a lot of rage. I have a lot of bitterness. I have a lot of resentment around that. And I heard all of that come up in what I was saying. I also heard a huge amount of anger at doing so much work and having it be invisible. I mentioned this earlier. It's not like going to the gym and getting super swole and people being able to see, oh my God, you must be working super hard because look at those muscles. This is all invisible work. And I heard myself have a lot of resentment, frustration, indignation about that, a lack of acceptance there. It should absolutely be a different way. It should be visible. So there were some judgments there as well. And of course, those judgments would trigger anger. Judging the world, judging other people, of course that would trigger anger and have me feel really angry at the reality of the situation. Ending on a positive note, though. So I mentioned that exposure blows and doing it alone blows. Here's a fun update. One of my best friends started doing exposure since I recorded the recording that you heard. I think it was over the summer that they started. And it is such a fucking relief. Oh my God. It's lovely to have these conversations with them and to be able to talk about what exposure homework feels like and leaning into the avoidance and watching ourselves avoid something and then going, oh fuck, my therapist is going to make that my next homework assignment. That's not a thing that would be written down in the handbook of here's what exposure therapy is like. It's just one of those little side effects of doing exposure, noticing yourself avoid and then being like, oh fuck, I've got to go do that now, don't I? It feels kind of like an inside joke that nobody else would know about, but my friend, they know about it now. And it is what a fucking gift. When they started, I was I feel very torn here because I feel really awful. I'm really sorry that you're having to go through it. I'm sorry that it's come to this, that there are things in your life that are unmanageable and that this is the way to manage them. I'm sorry that you're about to do a really painful thing. And I'm also simultaneously really fucking relieved that now I have somebody to do it with. And we can share in that experience together. So that's really fucking nice. Yeah. So that was our how-to guide of self-validation right there. I'm actually feeling okay right now. All of that avoidance that I was doing, I think I was anticipating that it would just have me feel really bummed out listening to myself and then getting my past self's experience. I had the concern that it would bum my future self out, my present self out, I guess. And it didn't really. Mostly I was just yeah, that fucking sucks. And I think part of it is this is past joy. There's nothing I can do to help past joy. Past joy's in the past. It's done. So there also wasn't the pressure of fix this. There was no way to fix it. All I could do was listen. Literally, that's all I could do. There's no way for me to time travel back and try to adjust past joy's experience. And there's something listening to somebody to fix, looking for opportunities to fix someone, is much more exhausting. There's a lot more writing on it of oh shit, I've got to solve this. But when I listen to somebody to validate only, not even to validate and then fix, just to validate, it's oh yeah, I can totally get your experience. I can fully dive into that. It sucks. Your experience sucks. What a fucking bummer. Yeah, I oddly have no emotional reaction to it. So that's weird. Okay, all right. Well, I'm going to stop while I'm ahead. Thank you for listening. Thank you for joining me on this very special episode of Let's Therapize That Shit. It's been a pleasure as always. And if you've been helped by what I've said, if you want to help support the podcast, a link to my Patreon is in the description. There's a couple different subscription tiers. And it really does help when you guys rate, review, and subscribe on whatever platform you're listening to. So go do that. Thank you. And I'm just going to peace out now and end this super abrupt. This has been Let's Therapize That Shit with your host, me, Joy Gerhard. If you like what you heard, please rate, review, subscribe, and tell your friends about it. I'll see you next time. Intro and outro music is Swan Lake Opus 20 by Tchaikovsky, performed by the London Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Anatoly Fistulari, and released on LP by Richmond High Fidelity London Records in 1952.